All right, so back again, this time to talk about Kelly Oliver's Witnessing, Beyond Recognition. Now, before hopping into it, a few things to say. You can find this on Podbean or wherever else you find your podcasts. You can also find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy, or if you can contribute via Patreon or PayPal or any way that you can, that'd be great. If you can't do it monetarily, just by subscribing, liking, sharing, any of that helps a lot. Now, I will say I'd like to thank some of the people that have been very helpful. Nicholas, Matt, Sebastian, John, Boz, James, and Ashley, who have all been really instrumental in helping me keep this going, at least at the consistency I have been doing it. Now, without further ado, let's hop right into this here. So, Kelly Oliver's Witnessing Beyond Recognition. So this book, like so many, starts with an introduction titled Beyond Recognition. So here she begins by presenting the work of Dory Lobb, who is a kind of a psychoanalytic historian, who at one point in his career was tasked with, working on the video archive for Holocaust testimonies at Yale. So he was among other historians looking at various testimonies about people who suffered through the Holocaust. And in this process, he recounts time when a woman who testified about an explosion that had occurred at a Nazi prison camp at Auschwitz specifically, because of a Jewish revolt, because of Jewish people fighting back, she described how on one of the buildings, 4 chimneys exploded. Now, historically, that was incorrect. She was wrong. Factually, only 1 chimney exploded. Now, for this little group of people, of which Dory Lobb was one of the participants or one of the people compiling this footage, among those people, the historians believed that then this woman's testimony was invalid, that it should be discounted because it was factually incorrect. Her eyewitness testimony was wrong, and therefore it should be discounted. Now, this didn't sit right for Dory Lobb and other psychoanalysts who were participating in this, because for them, what they saw in this woman was a recognition of something else going on. That is, because this woman didn't give what might be, a factually consistent or factually faithful testimony, does not mean that it was not demonstrating something else. And for Dory Lobb, the exaggerated testimony, that is, the testimony that described 4 chimneys exploding instead of 1, demonstrates for Lobb a survival strategy on the part of the Jewish people that saw any opportunity they could to bring themselves out of what historically might be one of the worst situations ever. And this was done, for the psychoanalysts, through this act of kind of exaggerating the facts, because there was some empowerment associated with that, because suddenly the Jewish people weren't as susceptible to the whims of the Nazi prison guards. They demonstrated some power, some capacity to challenge authority. So for the psychoanalysts then, empirical facts, the things that actually happened, are not quite as interesting. That is, again, this is just for the psychoanalysts, not quite as interesting as what goes unseen. The kind of psychological impulses behind this woman's desire to, share this testimony, even though it was incorrect, or to share this kind of testimony. And this is for Kelly Oliver, the author here. This is an example of that which goes beyond recognition. That which goes beyond simply the material. Simply things that we see out in the world, that we engage with, that, we can all be said to agree upon. It's about looking at what happens underneath the skin, especially considering it in a psychoanalytic way, what goes on in the psyche, what motivates people to think about these things in certain ways. Now, this presents a tension among historians who are so used to looking at the world through a certain lens, that is, through a very, empirical one here that Oliver is describing. They're so used to that Kelly Oliver asks, is it really possible for the psychoanalyst, for the historian to see something new? If they are always going to be looking at it through the same lens, how is that lens, infecting the way that they see the world? And that forecloses a certain possibility for Oliver. And this is a possibility that is afforded by, in this case, the psychoanalysts who look beyond simply what we see, beyond recognition, into the very processes of recognizing oneself. At least this is what the historian tries to maintain on the surface, where Kelly Oliver recognizes that that's actually quite impossible for there to be a kind of pure echo chamber or feedback loop between the historian and the world that they are observing. That is because the only way that people, at least for Oliver, develop the capacity to see is by having seen things that they don't understand. So there is embedded within any kind of gaze, within any process of seeing, the capacity to recognize the unknown. And that's something that Oliver contends the historian is trying to suppress, right? Because everything comes down to historical facts. And if we can unearth these facts, we can have a better kind of sketch of how history moved, let alone, all the people that engaged in it, all of the kind of subtle motivations that don't lend themselves to a kind of easy identification. What happens to all of that? And that is where the psychoanalyst steps in as just one example, to look at the underwriting things that we don't see just with our eyes. So what are some of the possible consequences of this? Well, if the historian looks at the world through their own lens, then anything that doesn't abide by that lens, that anything that doesn't comply to that gaze, the case of the Jewish woman at the beginning here, for example, how her testimony was going to be completely thrown out because it was factually incorrect. Anything that doesn't abide by that gaze or fit it is then treated with a certain degree of hostility and antagonism. Now those are the stakes for Oliver. She recognizes that this desire to maintain a kind of status quo kind of births an othering that necessarily leads to hostility. And this kind of move might be said to portend, that is, come before, or it might follow this. It might be said to portend or come before the formation of a subject-object split, where those historians view themselves as subjects that have, this kind of critical engagement with the world, whereas the things they are seeing are just reduced to objects, things for their gaze, reducing history to things that can be seen and therefore can be understood. Whereas the psychoanalyst is someone that actually, demonstrates some degree of humility. And the psychoanalyst, if they're doing their job properly, lets the analyst and the person being analyzed speak for themselves so that they develop their own sense of autonomy. They are not being told, what is truth and what is not. So that's the difference here between the historian and the psychoanalyst in viewing this Jewish woman give this testimony, because the historian says it's not true, therefore she's irrelevant, we shouldn't include it. The psychoanalyst, why am I saying it like that? The psychoanalyst, on the other hand, recognizes that there is a lot there that can be kind of unpacked. Now here she kind of sets the tone for what this book is going to do. And what it's going to do is to try to think about subjectivity, not in terms of a subject-object split. That is, she doesn't want to say that subjectivity only emerges when someone or something is placed in contact with something that they necessarily must view as different from them. So, some of the thinkers that she takes aim at here, that she kind of mentions right at the beginning, are Judith Butler, Charles Taylor, Axel Honneth, and then throughout the book, she takes aim at Merleau-Ponty to some extent, Lacan, among a few others. And she believes that many of these approaches, what she puts under the category of critical theory, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but I won't get into that. I will. Critical theory is really restricted to, in some sense, the Frankfurt School. Like, they are who is doing critical theory. Judith Butler isn't really a critical theorist. She's a post-structuralist, feminist. But anyways, that's beside the point. Kelly Oliver believes that these thinkers, in their effort to kind of deconstruct the Enlightenment subject, that is the subject that is, they are the center of the universe, they, are comprised of all possibility. These thinkers come along and say, no, your subjectivity is predicated on in many ways, very colonial acts of othering others, so that you can then claim yourself to be a subject. So while Kelly Oliver recognizes that these have been noble efforts on the part of these theorists, she says that they inadvertently reinscribe a kind of oppressive dynamic, because they say that subjectivity only comes out of a relationship to an other, rather than it being, a thing that you're just kind of born with. So what Kelly Oliver wants to try to do then is to find a way to bridge subjects and others, to move beyond that language, to move beyond recognition, where it's a matter of finding my identity in the other by recognizing the other and the other recognizing me. Instead, it is about witnessing. That is, it is about seeing, and through that, recognizing not an otherness, but recognizing another subject. So we are subjects among other subjects, not subjects among objects. Now, she contends that these theorists have their roots in Hegel's thought. Now, without going into that too much, and it'll come up throughout the course of this book here, much of Hegel's work suggests that recognition, that is the ability to recognize myself as an individual, is predicated on me recognizing others as not being me. And that is, as others of being their own kind of being. So she takes aim at that because that implies that right off the bat, what we are doing is looking at difference rather than looking at similarity, which isn't an ontological condition. That is, it isn't something that we just do naturally. It's something that we do within a certain framework. It's something that only emerges, and you can insert any explanation here. It could be colonialism, it could be industrialization, it could be, sexism. Anything that kind of moves us apart encourages us to think about difference as being the primary marker of recognition, whereas she wants it to be instead what is similar between us. So subjectivity is something that Kelly Oliver then applauds. She wants subjectivity to be extended to people. And what happens in the moment of recognition, or in that encounter, is that one side is stripped of their subjectivity and they are rendered objects. So in a dynamic, like let's say a colonial dynamic, where a colonizing people goes to another nation, what wouldn't have been a nation at that point, but that's how they thought about the world. They objectify those people and strip them of their autonomy and subjectivity, which is obviously wrong. Now, to remedy that, she positions witnessing over recognition. Because for her, recognition is the act of locating my own identity through the eyes of another. So in order to be recognized on the part of the colonized means that you are only seeking recognition on the part or by the part of the colonizer. Whereas witnessing for her is a way by which subjects, in their looking upon not only the world, but looking upon themselves, that is like the Jewish woman at the beginning who, through the psychoanalytic lens, can be said to be looking in upon herself or experiencing the world through her experiences, is then given a kind of autonomy, given a kind of subjectivity that has been stripped, taken from her, or taken, in the case of the colonized, taken from the colonized. Now, witnessing is not only a way to kind of reinscribe a lost subjectivity. It lies at the very, it is the condition for the possibility of any subjectivity, even before any oppression has occurred. And that is because witnessing is both, as I said, a witnessing of the outside, but a witnessing of oneself as well, what she calls the inner self. So rather than subjectivity emerging through a kind of antagonism, as we might see in like Hegel or these other theorists that I've already kind of briefly introduced, she says that subjectivity comes about when you have a healthy engagement with yourself and with the world. Now, another kind of supplement that she adds to this, she takes from Freud, hence the psychoanalytic commitment here. Freud's notion of working through. Where working through is whatever we might find threatening in relation to otherness and difference. So what we might at first glance recognize as a kind of antagonistic pole, that is a kind of possible other to us that we perceive as being hostile, is a thought that we must suppress and we must challenge by working through it and asking, why is it that I view this other? And this could be an other that is marked by race or gender or class, and it might not even be marked by any of these things, but it could just be the condition of seeing something other than yourself. Why is it that we immediately assume that this other is an other that doesn't share anything with me? Now, some might want to think that vision, because vision lies at the core of what witnessing or recognition are, vision is the culprit, because vision implies that I am separate from anything that I see, and anything that I see between myself and anything that I see is a kind of chasm or abyss of empty space. So she troubles that, she problematizes that a little bit by saying that this empty space is not actually empty. In her words, it's full of air, light, and the circulation of various forms of electrical, thermal, mechanical, and chemical energies that sustain us and connect us to each other and the world. So between myself and an other is not empty space, and this empty space is kind of traversed through by vision. No, there are many media that exist between myself and another, and we are both engaging with these media, and these media are what connects us. And instead of it being viewed as a kind of empty void between us, it is instead a very lively space in which we are both thriving. So these kinds of energies are not reduced solely to kind of mechanical ones or any that pertain to like the thermal energy or chemical energy or anything like that, but even just social energy, where, in various different settings, one's engagement with other people is determined by the setting itself. So let's say you go to a sporting venue and there's like a game being played. You feel a sense of connection with your fellow, sport people, fellow fans, and you form a kind of identity around that. Now, if you encountered these same people on the street, you would not at any point have that same desire to connect with these people. So she says that there's a kind of context, that is the social energy, can actually determine the way we engage with one another. So it is by virtue of that she asks, hey, the assumption that we, are necessarily antagonistic might have less to do with a kind of truth of our humanity, and instead might be determined by a specific kind of contextual framework, where we might be brought up in a setting, given the position I'm writing from, talking from like a North American, highly individualistic context, and it might be that setting, that context, that actually fosters this idea, and it's not like a quote-unquote truth of human interaction. So bringing us back here to this Jewish woman who gives this testimony, and keeping in mind what I just said about context, Kelly Oliver writes this: in order to evaluate her testimony as an eyewitness, it is crucial to consider her socio-historical subject position, and not just the accuracy of her testimony. So these contexts are what kind of set the stage for subjectivity, because we attain our sense of self in these contexts, in these settings, that put us in a position of responsibility to others. We are responsible for others. Now, the kind of individualistic dream of like total separation has never really been realized. I mean, the capitalist system that claims to foster this doesn't do it en masse. It relies upon various social programs. I mean, just the fact that we have stoplights at street corners or at intersections demonstrates that we are always working together to some extent. So there are these kind of underwriting tensions that I guess subtend our interactions with one another. So because we all work together, she says that there is a responsibility for responsibility. Now, what does that mean? She it's a little play on words. She says, we are responsible to be response able, that we are able to respond. Now, in addition to that, we are also responsible to be addressable. That is, we can be addressed by an other. So that puts us in an ethical situation, a kind of ethical dynamic between myself and others around me, other subjects, because it is not that any one person should experience something on their own. Instead, they should be, others should be willing to come to their aid, to be able to listen, to be, to make the person heard, not to feel like they're heard, but to actually be heard. And then that person too is in a position to reciprocate, where if the person being addressed is then able to give a response that recognizes the humanity, the kind of subjectivity of that first person. And that's a very long introduction, and as from here we move into chapter 1, Domination, Multiculturalism, and the Pathology of Recognition. So she starts out this chapter by thinking about the way that Frantz Fanon, who's famous for having written The Wretched of the Earth or Blackface, White Masks, how Frantz Fanon fits into this framework as a critical race scholar in this field. Because he is writing from a colonial setting. That is, he was writing from the French colony from Martinique, and he was a doctor trained in psychiatry. And he's writing from a certain subject position that implies a split between subjects and objects. Now, from his perspective, the colonizer is a subject that turns the colonized into objects. So he sees himself as being an object in this situation. So on first glance, this might be, and Oliver recognizes this, a kind of reinscription of the Hegelian subject-object split. But what Fanon does, at least for Oliver, is actually take aim at this whole process and to look at the way that recognition is in itself oppressive. Where what happens, according to Fanon, and that Oliver picks up on, is that when a group of people are objectified on the basis of their skin color, they become, in their mind, their skin color. They don't look upon themselves as subjects with any kind of like psychological depth. They are only their skin color. And for oppressed people, in Oliver's words, it is the dehumanization that motivates the struggle for recognition. So when you are dehumanized, you seek recognition in the very people that have wronged you, that have objectified you, because they are, in a sense, they wield a great deal of power. And so any effort to realize a kind of identity in those people, in this case the colonizers, is to reinscribe their authority and to reinscribe the efficacy, that is the potential or the usefulness of the subject-object split, or how well it works. So quite simply, the remedy would be if people, that is oppressed people, were to recognize their subjectivity in themselves and not hope it conferred upon them by an exterior other, that is, in this case, the colonizer. Now, it's important to note here that might be easier said than done, right? Like, how do people who only know oppression, undo that? And of course, this is something that we keep in the back of our minds when reading these kinds of texts. But that's kind of, whatever. So another person that Oliver positions here is Jacques Lacan. So Lacan is famous for his ideas about, the mirror stage, where for Lacan, our entering into subjectivity occurs at a pretty young age when we stand in front of a mirror and we see that, we are autonomous from our parent, our mother, specifically. So I see myself in the mirror for the first time, and in that moment, I recognize myself as being an autonomous, completely, detached self. And it is from there that subjectivity emerges. So Oliver says that Fanon's work troubles this, because what we see here is the suggestion that subjectivity always already happens to everyone. It is just a natural condition of life. Now, the problem is that then we do not have any way to engage with those moments, like colonialism, where subjectivity is actually used as a tool of oppression. How it's not just a kind of neutral thing that happens to everyone, how it is something that is used to justify very oppressive things. So with Black people, what we see instead is what is called a reverse mirror stage. So instead of in the mirror stage, the child attains a sense of their own identity, the reverse mirror stage, the child or the oppressed or the colonized or whatever attains their identity not in themselves, but in the other, where the other gives them this identity. The other bestows upon them an identity, which is a very oppressive encounter. It's a very oppressive dynamic. So that we can really understand this from the title of one of Fanon's books I already mentioned, Black Skin, White Mask, where, for Fanon, Black people are compelled to act a certain way, to be a certain way in order to be approved by the white colonizers. So this is one of the tensions of psychoanalysis itself, because in psychoanalysis, things like rejection, exclusion, projection, lack are naturalized. They're seen as something that affect all of us. And especially in like Lacan, where we are, by virtue of our position within language, we cannot actually experience things without them being mediated through language. So we always experience a kind of lack, because language doesn't actually satisfy those kinds of cravings in my very, very limited understanding of Lacan. So it would seem as though Fanon wouldn't be able to make much use of psychoanalysis. But as it turns out, he does. He makes great use of it. But in Oliver's words, he does it, or his hope is that by reflecting back the white mirror of double alienation with his own progressive mirror, he can begin the process of disalienation. So he's just using the master's tools to some extent to undo that project. Using psychoanalysis as a means of pointing out all of the shortcomings of it in terms of the encounter between colonized and colonized people and colonizers. Now, at the end of this chapter, she presents very quickly another split between the kind of Lacanian Hegelian framework of antagonism, that is recognition in the other, that implies a kind of hostility, with what Fanon is doing, where she says that the former, that is the antagonistic side, are working on a level of desire, whereas for Fanon, what he's interested in is in love and affect, because for love's affective dimension opposes desire's reason, or the kind of logical impulses behind desire. So in her words here, she says, while desire is a lack in relation to the other that is born out of a primordial alienation, affect is a movement toward the other that is born out of love. And then from here, we move into chapter 2, identity politics, deconstruction, and recognition. So she begins this chapter with Nancy Fraser's idea about affirmative versus transformative politics, where affirmative politics seek to ameliorate a kind of problem or tension that is plaguing, society, whereas a transformative politics tries to completely overhaul an entire system. So it'd be like the liberal solution versus, really a Marxist solution, where the liberal wants to just, add women to corporate positions, and then equality will have been reached. Whereas this is only a problem that's going to keep the system going. Now, it's a little bit unclear to me how Oliver perceives of this, because she says she likes Fraser. She says that this distinction is important, but she says that this distinction, because it works in this kind of binary way, does risk reinscribing a certain kind of a logic of a political action, one that privileges one over the other. That is transformative over affirmative. So Oliver isn't saying we should be affirmative, political people. We should be transformative. But she questions how much of this binary actually works to reinscribe the system, where we are able to say, hey, look, we are on the right side of things and you over there are doing it wrong, which for Oliver just reinscribes another subject-object split. So she says that we must remedy this with deconstruction, hence the title. Which, spoiler alert, she doesn't actually do. And it's one of the frustrating things is that she kind of teases it, like she's going to do it, but then kind of defers it to the next chapter and never does it there either. So I'm going to say what I think she would have wanted to say to some extent, because deconstruction is a very tricky idea, and I'm by no means an expert in it, but deconstruction implies not the act of undoing something, like deconstructing a house, for example. Deconstruction is the process, or it's the way by which we recognize that either side of a binary doesn't exist on its own, but is actually constitutive of the other side. And it constitutes the other side. So take hot and cold, a pretty, easy binary to grasp, hot and cold. Now, hotness nor coldness has an essence in itself, where hotness, in relation to a certain kind of coldness can actually be it can be scolding, whereas hotness in relation to another kind of coldness can be quite mild, where if you come in from the cold, if you come into your house after being in negative 30 or 35 degree temperature for working with Celsius, then, a 0 degree house seems quite warm, whereas, for someone who's coming from a 30 degree plus place, 0 degrees would be quite cold. So it's all kind of relative in that way. Now, deconstruction does that, but it almost takes it to another level. And it says that embedded within each are various components of the other, where it's not only a relative thing, but in fact, we rely upon the other in order to give a kind of identity to either. So another way to understand it, and this for me is probably the best example put forward by Eve Sedgwick in the Epistemology of the Closet, when she talks about how the binary between heterosexuality and homosexuality implies that heterosexuality is entirely dependent upon the existence of homosexuality for it to attain its kind of privileged status. So going back to the work of kind of Jacques Derrida, who was absolutely instrumental in forming this, the binary always implies a kind of hierarchy, right? It implies this privileging of one side over the other. Now, whether or not that's totally the case, who knows? But we can say for sure that the binary it's a construct. It doesn't exist like in nature, but it's something that we have created. And because of that, we can find various faults with it or extensions of our own faults within it. Okay, anyways. So that is not what she says, but that is what, one way we can undo this binary that I think she was alluding to. Now, instead, she looks at the work of two feminist and, critical race scholars, Maria Lugones and Iris Young. So Oliver identifies that in Lugones' work, she advocates for a kind of identity politics that marks a person, essentially reducing the racist encounter as one of difference. So she advocates for a kind of playfulness and transformation through what she calls world traveling that oppressors try to foreclose. So she's speaking from the context of a Latina woman who recognizes, and this is coming kind of out of the work of Gloria and Zaldúa, in that in being a kind of Latina American woman, you exist between two worlds. You are negotiating both an American identity and your Latina identity, and that represents a kind of tension, that an existing in between that I guess to some extent opens you up to certain possibilities, and that those are possibilities that should be fostered through playfulness, through care of others, through world traveling between different kind of cultural settings in order to expand your horizons, to just use a kind of common moniker. Now, Oliver challenges this by saying that world traveling and playfulness are actually, in many cases, luxuries only afforded to the dominant group. Additionally, though, the very idea of world traveling implies borders as kind of fixed lines. By saying that I'm going to travel to this place over here implies it reinscribes the existence of that place as being separate from this other place, or the place from which you are emanating from or coming from, which is just a subtle reinscription of the idea of borders. So that what that does is it reinscribes difference, whereas Oliver wants to see what binds us instead of what separates us. Now, like Lugones, the work of Iris Young is an effort to break down assumptions about fixity not like Lugones. Instead, Iris Young tries to break down ideas of fixity and identity politics and identity more generally, but it falls kind of short for Oliver because it simply reinscribes the same kinds of difference, where for Oliver, Young's notion of difference ultimately leaves social hierarchies intact. Now, here's another longer quote that Oliver's characterization of the two, where she says that with Lugones, we have two people separated by the abyss between worlds that can be crossed through an identification through an identification. Whereas with Young, we have two people separated by the abyss between differences that cannot be crossed through identification, but only through language. Now, to return to the idea presented at the beginning of the chapter, that is the split between affirmative and transformative politics, Oliver says that these two thinkers, Lugones and Young, belong to the realm of affirmative politics, and that they aren't proposing these grand solutions, nor are they actually getting at the core of these binary assumptions. They are just proposing what seem to be almost individualistic strategies to challenge oppression. And now she's going to consider Judith Butler's work in terms of this reinscribing these kinds of splits, with Chapter 3, Identity as Subordination, Abjection, and Exclusion. So for Butler, subjectivity is not something to applaud. Subjectivity emerges in response to a certain kind of oppressive system, that is one that, in the Foucauldian sense, produces us as subjects. Where, in her words, the foundation of subjectivity is oppression and abuse, whereas and Oliver does not like that. Oliver thinks that subjectivity is something that is actually quite fruitful. It's something that comes out of love and care. It's not something that just happens to us when we have been beaten down to nothing. When we are beaten down to nothing, in Oliver's words, we become objects. So when Butler says that subjectivity is something that happens to all of us in relation to this oppressive system, she is dodging the possibility that some people experience this differently than others. So this oppressive mechanism operates on different bodies than it does others. So in the United States, like obviously black female bodies are acted upon in oppressive, traumatic ways by the state way more than white bodies. But that is something we ignore if we just say that, oh, well, we are all oppressed by this system. We are all affected by it. So the task then for Butler is to do away with this entire process of subjectivity, to instead look at, to wrest us from that. Whereas Oliver wants to say, no, subjectivity is what gives us potential as witnesses, to be able to look at myself, to look at the world, and to then have a kind of ethical engagement with others whom I have recognized and have recognized me. So this is why in Butler's work, resistance is often reduced to like these almost haphazard moments, like performativity, where Butler says that performativity, like in drag, is something that challenges the system. But Oliver says, can we really say that? Because it seems like this challenge to the system is just happening by chance. Like you're just totally leaving this up to chance because it might not actually challenge the system. And if we are just existing kind of on the surface in that way, like as though our bodies are what are going to oppose the system, then we are ignoring our responsibility to others, our responsibility to ourselves, and our kind of interpretation and analysis of the situation in which we exist. And here that propels us into chapter 4, where I'll actually be joined by someone to help me explain this. So here we go. All right, so now I'm joined by Helene to help me talk through this chapter. And I don't know if you want to say anything about yourself. No? Nothing?
No, I'm good.
Well, anyways. All right, so this chapter, chapter 4, the necessity and impossibility of witnessing. So what's going on here?
So in this chapter, Kelly Oliver is really looking at what witnessing means and the sort of paradox that is the necessity of witness, of being a witness, of testimony when it comes to trauma and oppression, but also the impossibility of articulating that.
Why? Why is it impossible?
Well, Oliver uses some of Lob and Feldman's work here to talk about how trauma and oppression, experiencing these things is dehumanizing. And when you're dehumanized, you become an object, and objects can't speak. So you're taking position as a subject to talk about trauma, to talk through trauma, but you're talking about something that can't be spoken by a subject.
It can't be spoken by a subject. Or can it be spoken by a subject, but you don't have that capacity because you've been objectified?
Right, so you would be an object.
Right, you're an object, so you don't have that.
So so you can't be a human. You can't express dehumanization when you're in when you're in this position as a subject. It goes beyond language.
All right, yeah. So how then does the inner witness or the inner self figure into this?
So the inner witness is a term, again, from Dory Lob. And this is sort of, she talks about it as being necessary for having a sense of oneself as a subject. And this is a sort of again, a negotiating voice between subjectivity and subject position, which is your location, your context, the context in which you live as a person in that conversation with the other who's also might occupy a different subject position. Right.
So having kind of recognized that there's a necessary interaction not only with yourself, between yourself and your inner self, but also between yourself and others, how do subjects, if they've been objectified, have their subjectivity return?
So for Dory Lob, for Feldman, and for Kelly Oliver here, really the importance of subjectivity and responsibility lies in witnessing, and that is bearing witness rather than what she calls the eyewitness testimony. So you've probably talked about the example of the chimneys.
Yep.
So that's a really good example of what sort of witnessing means and the importance of witnessing. And she sort of expands on that here because this sort of highlights the responsibility of the listener to go beyond just what they see, and in order to learn and listen to the other's experience. So you might not have experienced the oppression or the trauma that the person is testifying about, but it's sort of saying, like, even though I haven't lived this, I acknowledge that it happens and that it happened to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a responsibility on the part of the person you're addressing to not only be there, but to recognize what had happened to you. Now, if we think about this in terms of like colonizers and colonized, does not the responsibility of the colonizer, if they want to atone for their sins in that rough language, then is that enough to just acknowledge what happened to the other person?
Yeah, I don't think there's any sort of atoning. I think that if I can turn more specifically to the examples Oliver uses in the chapter, she talks about Black women's testimony. I think that's in this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And how Black women's testimonies are always on trial. And so I think that's sort of a good example of when people aren't bearing witness.
What do you mean by on trial?
So she talks about how, she says here, when Black women's discourse is continually put on trial, it forces Black women into the paradoxical situation of both insisting on their legitimacy and the truth of their experience and doubting that their experience is legitimate or real. So, Black women are often disbelieved when they talk about what they're experiencing. We can think about intersectionality and Black women talking about experiencing racist sexism or sexist racism, and white women saying, like, well, I don't experience that, so what you're experiencing isn't real, or Black men saying, I don't experience that, so what you're experiencing isn't real. And so, yeah, I mean, this where you're bearing witness is where you're going beyond what you can't experience or see,
right?
And really paying attention to what's going on. And I think Oliver brings up a good point when she also talks about the doubting your own experience, the legitimacy of your own experience. And in my work, I think about sexual assault, and so you can think about like how rape culture would affect a survivor of sexual assault and how they might even come to disbelieve their own experience or the legitimacy of their experience by like blaming themselves for what happened to them, for example.
Yeah. And in order for any kind of fruitful encounter to be had, there has to be on the part of the oppressor, which is a pretty simple way to designate this person, but let's call them the oppressor, a recognition on their part of the reality of the other person's experience, even if it doesn't easily lend itself to a kind of empirical truth or a kind of historical fact, like with the Jewish woman at the beginning, who, in testifying that 4 chimneys exploded, was in contrast with the historical account. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a kind of truth to that experience on the part of the Jewish people who were challenging, the guards at Auschwitz.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we want to think about like more examples of this kind of thing, you can think about microaggressions get talked about a lot these days, and sort of people of color, for example, testifying to feeling, to experiencing microaggressions constantly every day, in ways that like white people might not see or even like consciously realize that they're doing it. So, for example, white folks taking up all of the sidewalk and not moving out of the way ever for Black folks. Or I think about Helene Bigras-Dutrisac, I might be butchering her last name, but her writing about phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty and the encounter of like white women in an elevator or any like closed sort of setting with a Black man and like clutching your purse in fear. Like these are microaggressions that like folks experience all the time and that affect people's physical and mental health. But you might not be able to see that. So bearing witness is about listening to those experiences, believing those experiences, and also like acknowledging the systemic structural violence that is taking place in the social contexts, and our own role in that in that encounter, in that setting.
So she says that Black women are forced to do something specific, like they're forced to speak in tongues in this setting. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah, she's citing Henderson there, and she's talking. I think what Henderson is saying is that Black women have to learn how to speak differently to different groups in different settings in order to survive. And I can't speak directly to that example because I haven't read Henderson, but it reminds me of Ortega, who I have read, and her sort of discussion of how women of color in the U.S. have to act differently in different settings in order to survive. And so she'll speak specifically about, in the academic setting, she has to act a certain way because she's understood a certain way by virtue of being a Latina woman. She might be like confused for a janitor or a cleaning woman in the academy, so she might not like laugh as much. She might try to like look a certain way. Like she has to think about how to be in different places all the time. Like now in the COVID era, I've been seeing a lot of things about the dangers of wearing a mask for Black men, for example, and how they have to consider what they look like in public in ways that white people don't even think about. They don't have to think about it. And in fact, they might encounter these stories with disbelief, which again brings us back to the importance of the type of witnessing that Oliver's talking about.
Yeah, that's a really good example to kind of, to hit the point home, especially the contextual nature of these kinds of interactions, how things in different contexts, you can't act the same way in every context. But yeah, and then one last thing before kind of wrapping this up is considering the way of looking at the performance of testimony, or how does performance figure into this?
Yeah, this is taken from Fellman also. And so we've sort of, I think, emphasized so far the importance of bearing witness to the performance of testimony by the part of the listener. But I also want to emphasize the importance of the performance of testimony, and so not merely the facts of what happened, what's being said, but the performance itself for the person testifying, because I think a lot of the time disclosure gets confused with testimony, and I think that testimony and witnessing in the ways that Fellman and Lobb and Oliver are talking about it go further than disclosure. So a disclosure might just be, here are the facts of what happened. For example, a sexual assault disclosure might be just, this is what happened, then this happened, and then this happened. But a testimony, a witnessing goes beyond, again, like just the events. And so the performance of testimony can mean a lot because it can really get at talking about the silencing of what happened, the oppression at the root of what happened, the violence at the root of what happened, that goes beyond the facts themselves. So to return to my example about sexual assault disclosures, this might be thinking through, talking through one's experience of sexual assault while thinking through the contexts in which it happened. So in like a Western North American cultural setting, that might be the rape culture, the fact that it was maybe allowed to happen, or that victim survivors get blamed for what happened, or that when you disclose to people, they asked you if you were drinking or what you were wearing, things like this. So you're really getting at the systemic and structural issues, the contexts around the trauma, and also hopefully looking to, like, this is where addressability and responsibility come in, looking to change, political change, collective action.
Yeah, beyond just, changing individual circumstances or situations.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think that's all.
All right. Well, that'll also wrap up this episode. So for anyone that listened, thanks a lot. If there's anything that I or Helene said that, you want to add something to, or that you feel like you should correct, then please feel free to. Please like and share and subscribe if you can. That would be greatly appreciated. But then otherwise, take care.
Thanks.